Hello everyone, so welcome to part 4 of our mini-series. For this one, I want to talk about the double entry accounting system. So the double entry accounting system is something that in accounting has been used for many years, and it basically states that for every transaction you have, there should be at least 2 accounts being used. Now, we covered the accounts in previous videos, and I hope you had the opportunity to explore the chart of accounts that I gave you. But as an example, if I am, for example, buying supplies, then the 2 accounts I would use would be cash, and it would be the account supplies. All right. So every transaction, even the simplest one, will always have 2 different accounts. And for every transaction you have, the total amount of debits you place and the total amount of credits should always be equal. No exception to this rule. So on this slide, I want to explain to you what are the basic rules of debiting and crediting for each one of the categories we covered. Right? So I'm going to explain if you should debit or if you should credit each one of the different accounts. In order to make that simpler, I divided it according to our typical accounting categories that we have, the account categories we have. So we have assets, we have liabilities, we have owner's equity, we have revenues, we have expenses, and I separated here as well dividends, because dividends is a little bit, even though it belongs to owner's equity, it's a little bit special. So it would be the exception, and I placed it here. All right, let's start with assets. Now, assets, the debit side increases assets and the credit side decreases assets. In other words, for example, cash is an asset. So if you receive cash, you would debit it. But if you spend cash, you would credit it. Liabilities and owner's equity is the complete opposite. In other words, for liabilities, debits will decrease liabilities, credits will increase liabilities. In other words, for example, let's imagine that you bought supplies but you did not pay, and you're using the accounts payable account. And that means that, for example, if you paid back, so accounts payable is like your tab to your supplier. So if you bought more stuff but you did not pay, so your tab increases and therefore you would credit it. On the other hand, if you paid back your supplier and therefore your tab is decreasing, so what happens is you would debit that amount. Owner's equity is similar as well. So every time the owners take out money from the business, you debit it. Every time the owners invest more in the business, you credit. Revenues is simple. Revenues, if you have something that decreases revenues, you put on debit. So for example, if someone returns something they bought, so you're decreasing your revenues, but I will cover that situation specifically later on, but you would debit. But most of the times, 99% of times, revenues are on the credit side. Expenses is obviously the opposite of revenues. If revenue is to receive cash, then expenses is to spend that cash. It's something that you have as a cost. So debit increases your expenses, credit decreases your expenses. Dividends is similar to expense on the sense that if you paid more dividends, this is considered kind of like an expense, therefore you debit it. But if you decrease or if you pay less dividends, you do credit. But the credit on the dividend side is very rare to use, so it's almost never going to be used. All right, what are the typical balances for each one of the accounts? Now, assets typically will always have a debit balance. Liabilities on the other side typically have a credit balance. Owner's equity typically have a credit balance. Revenues typically have a credit balance. Expenses typically have a debit balance. And finally, dividends typically have a debit balance. Now, if you notice, the trick here to remember is that the balance of each one of the accounts it's typically always on the plus sign. It's typically always on the plus side. And this is how you determine if you have to debit or if you have to credit an account. All right, so in this video we covered how to debit or how to credit accounts, when should we use it, and in the next couple of videos that we're going to have in this series, we're going to do some examples, and we're going to go through the process of actually determining for every transaction if it's a debit or a credit. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy. If you have questions, post it on the comment section below, and I'll see you on the next video.